Hi, this is O'Connor, and welcome to my short presentation where I take you through the mega trends. I'm going to give you a top 10 list of things that are going to happen post-COVID-19. But in part of that, I want to set out the context, and the big context of COVID-19 is part of the trade war, and it's actually morphed into COVID-19. It's the effect on supply chains. So let's get into this framework, and this framework will help us set up what we mean by the top 10 trends that I expect to happen going forward. Like at the start of the trade war, it's really focused on China. Most of the world's supply chains coming out of China. Chinese factories are making a lot of the stuff we have in our household around the world. We all know that. But the trade war started this sensitivity of, okay, I've got goods being made in China, they're exporting into USA. Can we continue to do that profitably? Sustainability as a result of the trade war. And then COVID-19 has come along since. Well, this uncertainty has really impacted on organizations that are managing supply chains in different ways. For SMEs, it's been different from MNCs. Let's have a look at the SMEs. The approach for SMEs is that it's the trade war and then COVID-19 has had a huge impact on SMEs because they're less likely to have a portfolio of suppliers around the world, a portfolio of factories like multi-sourced factories. They're less likely to do multi-sourcing like MNCs would do. They're less likely to have 500 or 600 suppliers like some multinationals have. And so for SMEs, it's likely that they've supply chains located in one country. And for those that have been located in China, they've had to make some big decisions like changing contracts to pass the costs of tariffs onto customers if they cannot move out of China, or shifting out of China completely, like GoPro moved their production in China that is focused on shipping to USA to Mexico. They set up a factory in Mexico for their sales in USA. They still produce in China, but for other parts of the world. Crocs, they have not moved out of China, but they actually closed down their factories altogether that were in Mexico and Italy. Another example, Rombo vacuum cleaners, they moved out of China and then moved down to Malaysia in the last 18 months. And so a lot of this has been spurred on by the trade war. So for SMEs, they've had to bite the bullet and make big factory location decisions as a result. Because to be sustainable, if the trade war continues, then you're just going to go out of business. And the big question about moving the factories, like it could take up to 2.5 more years to actually get the new factory located, settled down and in production and producing efficiently in the ways it had been if it was located in China originally. So what about MNCs? What's the difference for the multinationals? Well, because they have a portfolio of factories, and also they are increasingly having a substantial portion, if they are a worldwide brand, of sales in China itself. And so there's different incentives for them to actually move out of China. And if they do move out of China, it's a percentage of their factories that they're moving out of China. They're not moving out of China totally. And so like GoPro, they moved a percentage of their production from China to Mexico. And so multinationals are going to take an approach like that. They're not going to close down their operations in China 100%. They have a portfolio approach to having factories around the world and having sourcing supplies around the world. And they're going to manage that in a portfolio way. Let's just reduce our exposure of what we're sourcing from China by 20% down to 15%. So it's a different approach in their strategic thinking. Further to that, anyone that moves factories, moves their supply chain from China, out of China into other countries, they're not going to move from on cost alone. The trade war has brought cost to bear to that strategic decision, but there are other factors. And a good example I give is the factory, Swiss brand that make the international travel adapters. They moved out of China into Bangkok. And the main reason, well, there are three reasons: because there was under the table money going on in logistics, in moving stuff in and out of the Guangzhou province in China. They were worried about IP protection because they were getting 2 million hits on their website from China, but they weren't selling in China. And also finally was labor costs. They moved to Bangkok within 6 months. I was talking to the CEO after they moved, and they said, oh, Bangkok just put up minimum wage by 40%. So you just don't move factories for cost alone. There must be a whole multitude of factors for why you may move, and that's an example for this Swiss brand manufacturer. And so multinationals, they're thinking of other factors like IP protection, transparency, labor and skill. VF Corp, they do their 5-pocket variety, they manufacture in Mexico, but then they have their highly skilled factories in China making more high classy design jeans that they wouldn't get made in Mexico. So they're in China for the skill set. They're in China for the multinationals are in China for the ecosystem, especially if it's consumer electronics. The ecosystem in China is unmatched by any other country in the world in electronics ecosystem. Yes, there's other countries that do have electronics ecosystems, but they're much smaller scale. Vietnam has it, but it's a much smaller scale. They're still importing electrical components from China to support any consumer electronics manufacturer. Penang in Malaysia, yeah, electronics ecosystem, but they're still importing components from China. So you've got to think of the ecosystems when you're actually moving factories. And so it's going to be different from industry to industry to industry. Finally, another thing I want to mention about multinationals, and just setting this scene for the top 10 issues you need to think about going forward post-COVID, is that multinationals will tend to stay in a country and they're focusing more on driving innovation and change. And that's what's been happening for a lot of multinationals with working with their suppliers in China. IKEA is a good example. Giorgio Armani is a good example. S. Oliver, they're two good examples in the apparel. And they are actually working, they have virtual design teams traveling to China, working with designers in the factories so they can actually get speed to market going on faster. And so IKEA working with their factories in China, working with their suppliers to improve how the suppliers can become more efficient. And so they're thinking of different ways in which the suppliers can innovate and work more efficiently with those suppliers. The multinationals are also consolidating. They're consolidating the supply base. They're staying in China, but they're reducing the number of suppliers they source from. They are reducing the SKUs. And so a product that had 5 or 6 different colors, now they're selling the product with just 1 or 2 colors instead. So they can increase volumes and give more profitability for the suppliers to be sustainable in the supply chain. So, you know, these are things that are going on at the moment, and it was all spurred by the trade war. And especially with moving the virtual design teams, we're going to talk about that later on, because now you cannot send design teams into China because of the travel barriers. But let's just get back to what has been spurred on by COVID-19, and that is this notion of reshoring. And if anything, a lot of reshoring politics going on. It started with the trade war, but really it gained momentum, especially when you have the population wanting face masks, your population wanting medical equipment, or actually they're storming supermarkets for food, toilet paper and things. And it actually got governments of different Western developed countries to think more about, well, we need to reshore medical equipment, pharmaceutical, food. Wow. Okay, so you've got to think reshoring is a big thing that's on the table now, and it's going to be in the top 10 what I'm talking about shortly. The other thing, if we talk about other countries, yes, we can move the factory to Vietnam, to India, to Taiwan, to Malaysia, and I've given you some examples of that, but you need to think in terms of the ecosystem. Vietnam, Malaysia, India has in total of each of those countries a port capacity of about 10 million TFU, port capacity. China has over 170 million TFU. You can see 17 times larger than Vietnam or Malaysia or India. So port capacity is going to affect how much volume you can get out of a country when you're managing the supply chain. So these are strategic issues you need to think when you're moving a factory. The supplier ecosystem, another thing I mentioned, consumer electronics. So China is going to be dominant there. In automobile manufacturing, China is still going to be dominant there. Why? Because now China is going to be the dominant automobile market in the future. It's going to dominate automobile market in electrical vehicles in the future. And we're talking about by 2025, the market for electric automobiles will be 5 million per year in China by 2025. So you've got to be in China. Tesla has moved there. You have BYD, a major electrical vehicle manufacturer, homegrown in China. They learned their innovations and their success came from their working as a battery manufacturer from Motorola 20 years ago. Wow. So there's some background of what we need to think about if we're going to think about the top 10 issues. Let's get to our top 10 post-COVID-19 GSM global supply chain management trends. And now we've got some context. Let's put it into a summary of this top 10. Number one, consolidation of the supply trend I have mentioned earlier will continue in the future. We will consolidate suppliers. If we stay in China at multinationals, we will have less suppliers that we'll be working with. Consolidation enables you to strengthen your relationships with the supplier. It enables you to work with the supplier so they can become more efficient over time. Greater attention to second and third tier suppliers will occur. That has been very apparent in the apparel manufacturing. And so if you're in Nike, you're Puma, you are an Adidas, you are front and center on the world stage, the sports stage, and something goes wrong with your apparel, that is a death knell for your brand, and you need to know what's going on in the supply chain. And these brand names have, in the last 5 years, spent much more time getting to know who are their second tier suppliers, who are their third tier suppliers in the production line. Do they have underage labor? Do they have slave labor? They are very, very vigilant in terms of making sure they have transparency on the supply chain. That will continue. And up until COVID-19, they wanted to have virtual design teams in the factories for speeding up the design stage, but also getting people into the factories so they know where their supplies of materials are coming from, so they can actually control their second tier and third tier suppliers in terms of having visibility, in terms of environmental and social compliance. Number three, greater attention will be given to conducting disruption risk stress tests. In the past 10 years, increasingly, there's been a C manager in the C-suite that has looked after environmental and social compliance. Well, I think going forward, we're going to have a C manager reporting role in the C-suite about disruption risk and doing stress tests on the global supply chain. Not as a result of environmental and labor social responsibility, but because of disasters like the COVID-19, like the pandemic, earthquakes, fires in California, for example. You got the floods in the South America, for example. We need a C manager in the C-suite that tells the board what exactly are we exposed to when an event like this happens. And that hasn't been a dominant strategy in the past. Number four, greater attention and investment will need to occur to invest in supplier relationships after buyers cut orders in the last 6 months. That's been quite apparent, where buyers have just, at one stage there's been no demand because people are not going into shops, people are not traveling. Buyers have cut orders from suppliers and the demand has gone down, and suppliers have had to close up their factories. I know, talking to a factory that supplies Hush Puppies and Bata shoes, both those brands have cut orders and factories have been left with inventory. And where do they sell their shoes now? Where do they sell their stock? And basically they've gone from profits to losses as a result of that. Now, going back, when the demand ramps up again, those buyers need to go back and re-establish those supplier relationships, because those relationships basically has gone down to zero. They need to spend a lot more time re-establishing the relationships with the suppliers after they've cut the orders. Number 5, digitalization of supply management will accelerate. GAP, VF Corp, have been experimenting with the last 5 or more years with having digitalization of the QC checking in the factories in China and in other countries. How do they do that? They get their factory supervisors to actually learn how to put into a digital tablet any quality problems that are raised in different QC checks during the production line. So therefore, when it gets to the production end, there is no loss of any defects. Like, you normally put a tag on an item if there's a problem as it goes through production line. That tag may fall off. But what you do now, you put a tag on the item, but you digitalize it, and now it's digitalized, it doesn't get lost. And as a result, what is happening is when you get to the final QC, you have much more granularity of what is the problem batches in a batch that you may accept or reject for the final shipping. And you may not actually accept a batch because it has so much problems in it that have been digitalized, whereas in the past, some of those problems may have been let go as we got the production going through the production line. But now those problems can be assessed and actually attended to at the time that they are found. And so this digitalization, VF Corp, Gap, and other major brands are starting to have success with this digitalization of the QC checking in the factory. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, let's go to supplier location. I said a little bit about this before, but I'll say a little bit more about it now. Number 6, SMEs will continue to reassess factory moves, but if anything, they will delay investment or delay expansion of the factory. Number 7, multinationals consider redesign and invest in flexibility to reduce their dependence on particular countries. Although invest in flexibility, an example of investing in flexibility is multi-sourcing when in the past you didn't multi-source. And so I mentioned earlier about consolidating suppliers, but in particular stress test areas, they may decide to multi-source where they haven't multi-sourced in the past. Redesign, meaning that they may change the bill of materials. So some of the materials that are coming in that have to be shipped for products shipped to the USA may have less China content. They may redesign the bill of materials so it has more content from other places rather than China. Wow. Number 8, onshoring and diversification of sourcing. I told you about that. Diversification of sourcing and manufacture of PPE, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and food. Western developed countries, the governments are under pressure by their population to make sure that they have PPE masks, to make sure that they have enough pharmaceuticals, to make sure they have enough medical equipment and food. These are red hot items that governments are going to push for the reshoring and the ramping up. Maybe they're going to subsidize the manufacture of these areas to ensure that onshoring happens in these Western developed countries. Number 9, under the area of compliance regulations for importers of record. Factories in China especially will consolidate in order to manage pressures from global buyers and increase regulation on compliance costs. Earlier I said they may multi-source. They may not multi-source in certain stress test areas. So they may source in China, but also source in another country. That's what I mean, multi-sourcing across countries. But here in China, they may consolidate in order to enable the suppliers to be able to be sustainable under the cost pressures from global buyers and to be sustainable to actually do better in terms of compliance with respect to UL, FCC, CE from Europe, compliance with respect to environmental and social responsibility, compliance with respect to FCC in the USA with respect to electronic emissions, whether they're intentional or unintentional. Number 10, there is a greater push for making online internet platforms to take greater responsibility for substandard and non-compliance products sold in developed nations. This is really increasingly becoming important. Just a few weeks ago, Amazon has been taken to court, the government charging Amazon to be responsible for certain products that are not complying with various regulations. In the past, it was the importer of record that you took to court. Now they're trying to make Amazon to be responsible, even though they are not the importer of record. They're just a fulfillment by Amazon. They're just a warehousing and a logistics platform and a sales platform. But now the European government wants to make Amazon accountable. The US government wants to make Amazon accountable. So look for that trend where there's a greater push for these online internet platforms to be accountable rather than importer of records directly. What's going to happen, these online internet platforms are going to push that pressure onto their own sellers that are on their platform and force them to show more documentation to show that this compliance risk is not there in the first place. So there are our top 10 covering supplier management, supplier location, and compliance regulations for importers of record. I'm happy to go into one last thing, and we will just explain what a major trend that is happening, and that is this notion of transparency and its digitalization of the management system. Pivot 88 is a major player in this area. It's like software as a service, but they do provide hardware, tablets to the factories of your supply chain, and then they train the factories to digitalize the QC process in the factory. And Gap, VF Corp, and many other brand names are having success as we speak with this new service. So just want to finish there. There is our top 10: supplier management, factory location, compliance. Happy to take questions, and thank you for letting me be part of this sourcing global supply chain management session. Bye for now.